Dr. Jiho Kim's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his worn leather medical bag. The transport shuttle's doors hissed open, revealing the most incredible sight he'd ever witnessed. Kepler Station stretched before him like a living organism, made of metal and light. Massive transparent tubes carried floating creatures through the walls, while holographic displays flickered in languages his translator couldn't even recognize. The gravity felt different here, lighter somehow, making each step feel like he might bounce off the polished floor. Alien scents filled the air, something sweet like burnt sugar mixed with ozone, and metallic undertones that made his nose twitch. His heart pounded as he realized this wasn't just another medical school. This was the Galactic Medical Academy, and he was the first human ever to walk these halls. A small floating robot zipped past his head, chirping in what sounded like binary code before disappearing around a corner where the walls literally bent like liquid metal. Jiho's eyes widened as he watched the architecture shift and reshape itself, creating new pathways for different species who needed varying atmospheric conditions. "You must be the human specimen," came a voice that sounded like wind chimes in a thunderstorm. Jiho turned to see a creature that looked like it was carved from living crystal. Each facet of its body caught the station's artificial light and scattered it into tiny rainbows across the walls. The being stood nearly 8 feet, tall with sharp geometric features that somehow managed to look both beautiful and terrifying. "I'm Dr. Jiho Kim," he said, extending his hand before realizing the creature might not understand human greeting customs. The crystal being tilted its head, studying the outstretched hand with curiosity rather than recognition. "I am Christek, of the third prism. Your sleeping chamber is adjacent to mine. I have been instructed to assist with your integration." As they walked through the corridors, Jiho marveled at his fellow students. A group of slug-like creatures with multiple eyes slithered past, their skin constantly changing colors in what seemed like a complex conversation. Near a viewing port, a being made entirely of what looked like controlled electricity crackled and sparked while reading from a holographic textbook that kept reshaping itself. "The dormitories are designed for optimal species comfort," Christek explained, his voice creating small harmonic echoes in the hallway. "Each unit adjusts temperature, atmospheric composition, and gravitational fields according to biological requirements." They passed through a common area where the real diversity of the academy became apparent. A massive creature with tentacles instead of arms was delicately manipulating microscopic surgical instruments while suspended in a tank of bubbling green liquid. Nearby, several small furry beings with 6 arms each were working together on what appeared to be a 3-dimensional medical puzzle that floated in mid-air. "Your species fascinates the faculty," Christek continued as they entered what looked like a residential wing. "Most civilizations develop medical technology to compensate for biological limitations. Humans seem to have developed biological techniques to compensate for technological limitations." Jiho's room was surprisingly comfortable, with the walls automatically adjusting to display a simulation of Earth's sky. The bed molded itself to his body shape when he sat down, and the air tasted exactly like a spring morning in Seoul. "Down this corridor resides Mira," Christek said, gesturing toward a room that seemed to have no solid door, just a shimmering barrier of what looked like liquid starlight. "She is Etherian. Her people exist partially outside normal space-time. When injured, they simply phase-shift the damaged portions of themselves into alternate dimensions until healing is complete." As if summoned by the mention of her name, a translucent figure materialized through the wall. Mira appeared to be made of swirling gas and distant nebulae, with features that constantly shifted between solid and vapor. When she spoke, her voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The human has arrived," she said, circling around Jiho like a curious breeze. "Your electromagnetic signature is most unusual. Your species generates healing responses through controlled trauma. How wonderfully primitive." The third member of their study group arrived precisely on schedule. Zentok moved with mechanical precision, each step calculated and measured. His species looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a supercomputer, with multiple sensor arrays where a head might be, and appendages that constantly clicked and whirred as they processed information. "Greetings, human specimen," Zentok announced. I have completed preliminary analysis of your medical methodologies. The statistical probability of success using your species techniques appears inversely proportional to the time invested in proper analysis. Most intriguing. The next morning, orientation began in a massive amphitheater that seemed to exist in several dimensions simultaneously. Students from hundreds of worlds filled seats that adjusted automatically to each species' unique anatomy. Professor Glimmerdust, a being that looked like a walking rainbow with too many eyes, began the introduction to emergency medicine. "Welcome to Advanced Xenobiological Emergency Response," the professor announced, his colors shifting through the spectrum as he spoke. "Our curriculum follows established galactic medical protocols developed over millennia of careful research and ethical consideration." A holographic patient appeared in the center of the amphitheater, displaying what looked like a cardiac emergency. The being's multiple hearts were clearly malfunctioning, with vital signs fluctuating wildly across the display. "Standard protocol for cardiac intervention," Professor Glimmerdust continued, "requires 47 hours of multi-species consultation, comprehensive tissue analysis, genetic compatibility testing, psychological evaluation, family council meetings, and committee review before any physical intervention may commence." Jiho's hand shot up before he could stop himself. The professor's colors dimmed slightly as all eyes in the amphitheater turned toward the lone human. "Excuse me, Professor, but did you say 47 hours? On Earth, we'd have this patient stabilized within 10 minutes, maybe less." The silence that followed was so complete that Jiho could hear his own heartbeat. Kristek's crystalline form began shimmering with what looked like internal lightning. Mira's gaseous body swirled more rapidly, creating small whirlwinds in the air around her. Zentok's sensor arrays spun frantically as he processed this information. "You would intervene immediately?" Professor Glimmerdust asked, his colors, cycling through what Jiho suspected were expressions of shock and horror. "Without proper deliberation, without consulting the patient's extended family network, without determining the societal impact of the intervention. Sometimes we have to cut people open within seconds of seeing them," Jiho explained, trying to sound matter-of-fact. "If someone's bleeding out or their heart stops, you don't have time for committees. You just have to act." The amphitheater erupted in chaos. 3 small insectoid students collapsed in what appeared to be shock-induced comas. A group of plant-like beings rustled their leaves in what sounded like horrified whispers. Several aquatic species in their mobility tanks began releasing clouds of what Jiho hoped were just stress pheromones. Kristek leaned over and whispered, "Human Jiho, I believe you may have just described what most galactic civilizations would consider medical barbarism." "But people live," Jiho whispered back. "Isn't that what matters?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything the Galactic Medical Academy represented. The medical simulation chamber buzzed with nervous energy as 200 alien students filed into their assigned positions. The room itself was a marvel of galactic engineering, with walls that could project any environment and gravity generators that could simulate conditions from a dozen different worlds simultaneously. Holographic displays floated throughout the space, showing vital signs, atmospheric readings, and complex medical data that most species needed hours just to interpret. Professor Glimmerdust's rainbow-colored form pulsed with anticipation as he activated the central hologram. The image that materialized made several students gasp in horror. A Zentarian patient lay writhing on the floor, his right arm completely severed at the shoulder. The limb had been thrown 3 feet away by whatever accident had caused the injury, and thick purple blood was pooling beneath both the patient and the detached appendage. The holographic Zentarian's breathing was rapid and shallow, his large black eyes rolling back as shock began setting in. His remaining 3 arms clutched desperately at the gushing wound, while his species' characteristic humming sound grew, weaker with each passing second. "Students," Professor Glimmerdust announced, his colors shifting to authoritative, deep blues and purples, "this is your first practical examination. You are witnessing a grade 7 traumatic amputation with associated hemorrhagic shock. Standard galactic medical protocol requires careful analysis before any intervention." A massive timer materialized above the scene, its glowing numbers reading 72 hours and counting down. Several alien species immediately began forming discussion circles, their voices creating a cacophony of clicks, whistles, and harmonic vibrations that the chamber's translation system struggled to process. Christek's crystalline form caught the light as he turned to address the nearest group of students. "I propose we establish a primary consultation committee," he announced, his voice creating musical echoes throughout the chamber. "We must consider the patient's mineral content, crystalline structure compatibility, and the probability of successful limb regeneration versus prosthetic integration." Nearby, a cluster of slug-like Malarian students began secreting a planning pheromone that formed complex chemical equations in the air above their heads. Their senior representative, a being whose skin constantly shifted through dozens of colors, spoke in rapid chemical bursts that translated to detailed discussions about tissue compatibility and rejection protocols. Mira's ethereal form drifted toward the holographic patient, her gaseous body shimmering as she prepared to phase through the projection. "I shall analyze the molecular disruption patterns," she announced, her voice echoing from multiple dimensions simultaneously. "Perhaps the injury exists partially in alternate spacetime configurations that require dimensional healing techniques." Zentok had already deployed 17 different sensor appendages, each one clicking and whirring as it gathered data about the patient's condition. His mechanical brain processed thousands of variables per second, calculating probability matrices for every possible treatment approach. "Initial analysis indicates 43 potential intervention strategies," he announced. "However, proper evaluation will require extensive modeling to determine optimal outcomes." Other groups of students were equally methodical in their approach. A team of crystalline beings from the Andromeda sector began growing specialized healing crystals that would take at least 2 days to mature. Several energy-based life forms started harmonizing their frequencies to create what they called therapeutic resonance patterns, a process that required perfect pitch maintained for several hours. The insectoid Vexani students formed a complex, geometric pattern on the floor, their telepathic conference creating visible waves of psychic energy as they debated the ethical implications of forced tissue reattachment versus allowing natural regeneration cycles to proceed. In the midst of all this careful deliberation, Jiho Kim walked calmly toward the holographic patient. His movement was so simple and direct that it took several seconds for anyone to notice what he was doing. While 200 of the galaxy's brightest medical students engaged in complex theoretical discussions, the human had simply stepped forward and knelt beside the injured Zentarian. From his worn leather medical bag, Jiho pulled out a device that looked absurdly primitive compared to the sophisticated medical technology surrounding him. The tourniquet was nothing more than a fabric strap with a simple tightening mechanism, the kind of tool that human battlefield medics had been using for centuries. Without hesitation, Jiho wrapped the tourniquet around the patient's arm stump, just above where the limb had been severed. He twisted the mechanism with practiced efficiency, applying pressure until the purple blood flow reduced to a trickle, then stopped entirely. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The patient's vital signs, which had been steadily declining, began to stabilize. His breathing became less labored, and the dangerous pallor that had been spreading across his skin started to fade. "What are you doing?" Professor Glimmerdust's shriek cut through the chamber like a laser blast. His rainbow colors flashed through alarming shades of red and orange as he rushed toward the scene. "Student Kim, step away from the patient immediately. You have not received authorization for intervention." But Jiho was already moving to the next step. He had grabbed the severed limb and was examining the wound sites with the kind of focused intensity that came from years of emergency room experience. "The bleeding stopped," he said matter-of-factly, "but we need to reattach this within 6 hours or tissue death will make it impossible." The chamber fell silent, except for the soft hum of the holographic projectors. 200 alien beings watched in fascination as the human began working with tools that looked like antiques compared to their advanced medical technology. Jiho used what appeared to be simple metal instruments to clean debris from the wound. Sites then began the delicate process of connecting blood vessels, nerves, and muscle tissue. His hands moved with mechanical precision, each suture placed exactly where it needed to be. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no consultation with committees or databases. He worked like someone who had done this procedure hundreds of times before, which in fact he had during his residency at Seoul National University Hospital. Christek's internal light patterns flickered rapidly as he tried to process what he was witnessing. "The human is performing surgery," he whispered to Mira, his voice creating harmonic overtones of disbelief. "He is cutting into living tissue without proper authorization, without committee approval, without even consulting the patient's medical history." Mira's gaseous form swirled with agitation as she watched Jiho work. "He is causing deliberate trauma to the patient's body," she said, her voice echoing from several dimensions at once. "This appears to be the opposite of healing. How can damaging tissue result in therapeutic outcomes?" Zentok's sensor arrays spun frantically as he tried to calculate the probability of success for Jiho's approach. "The statistical models are incomprehensible," he announced. "The human's methodology has no basis in established medical theory, yet the patient's vital signs continue to improve." Around the chamber, other students began abandoning their careful deliberations to watch the spectacle. The Malarian Planning Committee dissolved as its members crowded closer to observe the primitive surgical techniques. The crystalline healers stopped growing their therapeutic crystals, their attention completely captured by the human's direct approach to medical intervention. 37 minutes after he had first approached the patient, Jiho tied off his final suture and stepped back from his work. The Zentarian's arm had been completely reattached, with all major blood vessels, nerve pathways, and muscle groups properly connected. The patient was breathing normally, his skin color had returned to its healthy purple hue, and he was beginning to show signs of emerging from traumatic shock. The holographic display above the patient flickered and updated its readings. New text appeared in glowing letters that everyone in the chamber could read. Patient survival probability, 94.7%. Full limb function recovery, 91.3%. Estimated recovery time, 12.4 standard days. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Professor Glimmerdust's colors had shifted to what Jiho would later learn were expressions of profound confusion mixed with reluctant admiration. The alien students stared at the human with expressions that ranged from horror to fascination to something that might have been respect. Christek was the first to speak, his crystalline voice barely above a whisper. "The human, he mutilated the patient to save them." His internal light patterns pulsed with the effort of trying to understand this concept. He caused additional trauma as a method of healing. Word of what had happened spread through the Academy's communication networks, faster than light-speed data transmission. Within hours, every student, professor, and administrator on Kepler Station had heard about the human who had ignored 72 hours of proper medical protocol and somehow achieved a near-perfect treatment outcome in less than 40 minutes. The debate that followed would reshape galactic medicine forever. Was Jiho Kim a brilliant innovator who had discovered a revolutionary approach to emergency treatment, or was he a dangerous barbarian whose reckless methods threatened everything civilized medicine represented? Most of the galaxy leaned toward the barbarian theory, but nobody could argue with the results. The emergency klaxons pierced through Kepler Station like the screams of dying stars, their bone-rattling wail dragging Jiho from deep sleep at exactly 300 hours. But these weren't the gentle chimes used for simulation drills. These alarms carried the unmistakable urgency of real disaster, their pitch rising and falling in patterns that made his human nervous system flood with adrenaline. Jiho rolled out of his adaptive bed and grabbed his medical kit, muscle memory from years of emergency calls kicking in automatically. Through his room's transparent aluminum viewport, he could see debris spinning lazily through space, chunks of twisted metal catching starlight as they tumbled away from the station's damaged outer ring. Emergency beacon lights strobed red across the hull breach, illuminating what looked like the shattered remains of a massive cargo vessel embedded in the station's civilian sector. The corridors were chaos. Emergency containment fields flickered, blue and white as the station's AI worked desperately to maintain atmospheric pressure. Alien civilians fled past him in panic, their various breathing apparatus and mobility suits creating a bizarre parade of galactic diversity united only by terror. A family of crystalline beings tinkled like broken glass as they hurried toward evacuation pods. Gaseous entities swirled through the emergency lighting like living clouds of fear. When Jiho burst into the Academy's medical bay, the scene that greeted him was worse than anything he'd witnessed during his residency at Seoul National. Bodies were everywhere, scattered across the floor in pools of blood that ranged from red to purple to colors he didn't have names for. The air reeked of ozone, burnt metal, and the sharp tang of alien body chemistry under extreme stress. Professor Glimmerdust stood in the center of the chaos, his rainbow colors cycling rapidly through what Jiho now recognized as panic patterns. 3 holographic medical databases projected around him simultaneously, their screens scrolling through thousands of treatment protocols at light speed while he gestured frantically at the displays. Multiple species trauma protocols require cross-referencing, the professor announced to no one in particular, his voice cracking with stress. I need consultation matrices for 17 different biological classifications. Where is the Xenobiological Ethics Committee? We cannot proceed without proper authorization frameworks. Around him, the alien medical staff stood paralyzed by the magnitude of the disaster. A team of insectoid medics clustered together, their antennae twitching as they tried to establish telepathic consensus on treatment priorities. Several energy-based life forms flickered uncertainly, their normal healing harmonics disrupted by the overwhelming cacophony of pain and fear filling the medical bay. The patients themselves painted a horrific picture of the cargo ship collision's aftermath. A massive Theraxian trader lay unconscious, one of his 6 arms twisted at an impossible angle, while green fluid leaked from multiple wounds across his chitinous shell. Nearby, a family of small, furry beings huddled together, their leader making weak mewing sounds as bright blue blood pooled beneath her damaged leg. In the corner, something that looked like a living plant creature had lost most of its branches, its root system exposed and withering in the medical bay's artificial atmosphere. We need immediate triage protocols, Professor Glimmerdust shrieked, his colors flashing through alarming shades of red and orange. Form committees by species type, establish biological compatibility matrices, someone contact the Galactic Medical Ethics Board. But while the aliens debated procedures and formed committees, people were dying. Jiho pushed past the professor without ceremony, his human urgency cutting through alien bureaucracy like a laser scalpel. He pulled colored tags from his medical kit, the same simple triage system that Earth's emergency responders had perfected through centuries of disasters, wars, and medical crises. Red tags went to the patients who were dying but might be saved with immediate intervention. Yellow tags marked those who were seriously injured but stable enough to wait. Green tags identified the walking wounded who could be treated later. The black tags, thankfully, weren't needed yet, but Jiho kept them ready for the patients who were beyond help. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, sorting through the chaos with the kind of brutal clarity that only came from experience with real emergencies. The massive Theraxian got a red tag and went to the front of the line. The furry family leader got yellow. A conscious but injured crystalline being received green and instructions to help others. You, Jiho shouted at Kristek, who had been standing frozen in the doorway since arriving at the scene. Stop gawking and get me plasma expanders for the blue blood species. Those small furry ones are going into shock. Kristek's crystalline form shimmered with confusion. But we haven't established proper consultation protocols for cross-species pharmaceutical compatibility, he protested, his musical voice cracking with uncertainty. People are dying while you talk, Jiho snapped back. Move! The authority in his voice cut through Kristek's paralysis, the crystalline being rushed toward the medical supply chambers, his internal light patterns flickering with what looked like determination mixed with terror. Mira, Jiho called out to the ethereal being who was hovering uncertainly near the ceiling, I need you to phase through that collapsed debris section and check for more survivors. Your species can go places the rest of us can't reach. Mira's gaseous form swirled with agitation, "The dimensional barriers are unstable," she protested. "Phase shifting through damaged matter could result in molecular displacement errors. So, could bleeding to death while we debate it," Jiho replied, already moving to his next patient. "If there are people trapped in there, you're their only hope." Something in his tone must have resonated with her, because Mira's form solidified slightly, before she dove through the twisted metal debris like a living ghost. "Zentok," Jiho barked at the mechanical being who was still running calculations in the corner. "Stop processing probability matrices and start moving patients. I need that thoraxion on the main surgical table now." Zentok's sensor arrays spun frantically. "The statistical models for optimal patient transport methodology require additional data input," he protested in his precise mechanical voice. "Zentok, if you don't help me move this patient right now, your statistical models are going to show a 100% probability of death," Jiho said with deadly calm. The mechanical being's calculations stopped abruptly. Without another word, he extended his lifting appendages and began carefully transporting the massive injured trader toward the surgical area. In the midst of organizing this chaos, Jiho noticed a small Cytherian child curled up behind an overturned medical cart. The little being couldn't have been more than 5 years old by human standards, with soft grey fur and large eyes that held far too much pain for someone so young. A severed artery in her leg was pumping bright orange blood across the floor, in a rhythm that matched her rapidly weakening heartbeat. While a group of alien students formed an emergency committee to debate pediatric subspecies treatment protocols, Jiho grabbed the nearest clamp from a surgical tray and dove toward the child. He pressed his fingers against the artery above the wound, feeling the life-giving fluid pulse against his skin as he worked to stop the bleeding. The Academy's surgical instruments were designed for precision work under carefully controlled conditions, not battlefield medicine in the middle of a disaster. When Jiho couldn't find the right size clamp for the child's small artery, he improvised. A butter knife from the medical bay's small kitchen area, sterilized quickly in the food processor's cleaning cycle, became an emergency surgical tool. "This is barbaric," Professor Glimmerdust protested, his colors shifting to horrified purples and blacks as he watched Jiho work with improvised instruments. "You're using kitchen utensils to perform surgery. This violates every principle of civilized medicine." Jiho didn't look up from his work as he carefully sutured the tiny artery with thread designed for much larger patients. "This is medicine," he replied, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "And right now, barbaric medicine is the only thing keeping your students alive." The Cytherian child's bleeding stopped. Her breathing stabilized. Her large eyes focused on Jiho's face with something that might have been gratitude, though he couldn't be sure with alien facial expressions. Around the medical bay, other patients were being stabilized through Jiho's unconventional but effective triage system. Christek had returned with plasma expanders and was learning to administer them under Jiho's rapid-fire instructions. Mira had phased back through the debris with 3 more survivors who would have died if she hadn't found them. Zentok was efficiently moving patients according to Jiho's priority system, his mechanical precision finally being used for something more useful than endless calculations. Even Professor Glimmerdust had stopped consulting his databases and started helping, though he continued to mutter about the violation of proper medical protocols as he worked. For the first time since arriving at the Academy, Jiho felt like he was practicing real medicine instead of participating in elaborate theoretical exercises. This was what he'd trained for during those brutal years in Seoul's emergency rooms. This was why humans had developed their apparently barbaric approach to medical intervention. Sometimes, when people were dying, you didn't have time to form committees or consult databases or debate ethics. Sometimes you just had to act. The medical bay had transformed into something that looked more like a battlefield hospital than the pristine academic facility it had been just 48 hours earlier. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across jury-rigged treatment stations where alien patients recovered from injuries that should have killed them. The air recyclers worked overtime to process the mixture of atmospheric requirements for 7 different species, creating a complex cocktail of gases that made breathing feel thick and strange. Jiho moved through the recovery ward like a ghost, his exhaustion so complete that he seemed to float rather than walk. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually steady hands trembled slightly from too much caffeine and too little sleep. But he couldn't stop checking on his patients, adjusting IV lines jury-rigged from hydroponic equipment, monitoring vital signs on displays calibrated for alien physiology. He was still learning to interpret. The casualties told the story of the cargo ship disaster in painful detail. 23 beings from 7 different worlds, ranging from a massive Gorlakian trader, whose rock-like skin had been cracked open like an eggshell, to tiny Pixarian scouts, whose translucent bodies showed every internal injury in horrifying clarity. What should have been a simple medical emergency had become a cross-species surgical marathon that tested every improvisation skill Jiho had learned during his residency. Christek found him sitting beside a recovering Etherian child, whose gaseous form flickered weakly in a specialized containment field. The little being had nearly dispersed completely during the accident, her molecular structure damaged by exposure to hard vacuum. Jiho had somehow managed to stabilize her using electromagnetic field generators borrowed from the physics lab, a procedure that had no basis in any medical textbook but had worked nonetheless. "Human Jiho," Christek said softly, his crystalline voice creating gentle harmonics in the quiet ward. His internal light patterns pulsed with confusion and something that might have been respect. "I have been observing your methods for 2 standard days. Your approach to healing contradicts everything I have learned about medicine." Jiho looked up from the child's monitoring display, his eyes focusing with effort. The Etherian's vital signs were stable now, her gaseous form maintaining coherence within the containment field. But it had taken 16 hours of constant adjustment to reach this point. "Yeah, I get that a lot around here," Jiho said with a tired smile. "Professor, Glimmerdust has used the word barbaric 47 times since this started. I've been counting." Christek's form shifted, light refracting through his faceted body as he struggled to formulate his question. "But why do you hurt them to heal them? When you operated on my roommate Vexar, you deliberately cut through healthy tissue to reach the damaged areas. You caused additional trauma to repair existing trauma. The mathematics of this approach seem counterintuitive." Jiho sat down heavily on a medical stool that automatically adjusted to his human physiology. Around them, the recovery ward hummed with the sounds of alien life support systems, each one calibrated for a different species' survival requirements. The diversity was staggering, and yet somehow his crude human medical techniques had managed to save most of them. "My people have been fighting death for thousands of years," Jiho began, his voice carrying the weight of human history. "We've had plagues that killed millions, wars that lasted generations, natural disasters that wiped out entire cities. We learned early that death doesn't wait for perfect solutions." He gestured toward the Etherian child, whose form was becoming more solid and vibrant with each passing hour. "You see mutilation when I cut into someone. I see a second chance at life. Every scar represents a moment when someone refused to give up." Christek's internal lights pulsed thoughtfully. "But surely there must be less invasive methods. My people can regenerate damaged tissue through harmonic resonance. The Malarians use biological restructuring. Why do humans choose such violent intervention?" "Because we can't regenerate," Jiho explained simply. "We can't phase shift our injuries into other dimensions or harmonically restructure our cells. When a human gets hurt, we stay hurt unless someone fixes it. So we learn to fix things fast and fix them well, even if the process looks violent to other species." Mira materialized beside them like a living nebula, her gaseous form swirling with the subtle colors of concern. During the crisis, she had proven invaluable at reaching survivors trapped in spaces too dangerous for solid beings to access, but watching Jiho work had clearly disturbed her ethereal sensibilities. "Your methods are undeniably efficient," she admitted, her voice echoing from multiple dimensional layers, "but I struggle to understand your decision-making process. When multiple patients required immediate attention, how did you determine treatment priority? By what calculation did you decide which lives to save first?" Jiho's expression darkened slightly, and he was quiet for a long moment before answering. This was the question he'd been dreading, the one that struck at the heart of what made human emergency medicine so different from galactic standard practice. "That's the worst part of what we do," he said finally. "Sometimes you can't save everyone. Sometimes you have to choose, so you save who you can and learn to live with the rest." The simple honesty of his answer seemed to shock both aliens. Mira's form swirled more rapidly, creating small whirlwinds of displaced air as she processed this concept. Krestek's light patterns flickered through what Jiho had learned were expressions of profound confusion. "You make life and death decisions without complete information?" Mira asked, her multidimensional voice carrying undertones of horror. "How do you calculate probability of success? How do you determine optimal resource allocation?" "We don't," Jiho said simply. "We guess. We make our best guess based on experience and training, and we accept that sometimes we'll be wrong, but doing something is usually better than doing nothing." Zentok approached their small group, his mechanical form moving with uncharacteristic hesitation. Throughout the crisis, the calculating being had struggled more than any of them to adapt to Jiho's rapid-fire medical style. His need for complete data analysis conflicted directly with the human approach of acting on incomplete information. "Human Jiho," Zentok said, his sensor arrays rotating slowly as he spoke. "I have been running probability matrices on your treatment decisions for the past 37 hours. The statistical models are incomprehensible. How do you function without complete data? How do you make critical decisions based on incomplete information sets?" Jiho looked at the mechanical being with something approaching sympathy. Of all his alien classmates, Zentok seemed to struggle most with the concept of intuitive decision-making. "Because complete data doesn't exist in an emergency," Jiho explained patiently. "By the time you finish gathering all the information you want, the patient is dead. So we work with what we have, make educated guesses and hope for the best." "But the margin for error," Zentok protested, his appendages clicking nervously. "Is huge," Jiho agreed. "That's why we train so hard. That's why human medical school is brutal and competitive and stressful. We're not trying to create perfect doctors. We're trying to create doctors who can function under pressure, who can make life and death decisions with incomplete information, and who can live with the consequences of being wrong." Around them, the recovery ward continued its quiet symphony of alien life support systems. The Gorlakian traders' rocky breathing had stabilized. The Pixarian scouts' transparent bodies showed steady healing. The Etherian child flickered with increasing strength. 14 beings from 7 different worlds, alive because one human had been willing to act without committee approval or complete data or perfect conditions. For the first time since the crisis began, Jiho's alien classmates started to understand something fundamental about human medicine. It wasn't just a different approach to healing. It was a completely different philosophy about life, death, and the responsibility of those who stood between them. They saw the brutal compassion that drove every human medical decision, the willingness to cause pain, to prevent death, the acceptance of responsibility without guarantee of success, the courage to act in the face of uncertainty, the strength to carry the weight of both triumph and failure. Most importantly, they began to understand why humans had developed such an apparently barbaric approach to medicine. When you couldn't regenerate, couldn't phase shift, couldn't harmonically restructure your way out of injury, when death was permanent and irreversible, you learned to fight it with everything you had. Even if that fight looked like violence to the rest of the galaxy, the graduation amphitheater on Kepler Station had been transformed into something that resembled a galactic United Nations assembly. Representatives from 47 different star systems filled the floating observation platforms, their diverse forms creating a spectacular display of interstellar diversity. Crystalline beings refracted the ceremonial lighting into rainbow patterns across the walls. Gaseous entities swirled in contained atmospheric bubbles. Mechanical civilizations sent delegates whose sensor arrays gleamed like technological Christmas trees. 6 months had passed since the cargo ship disaster, and the ripple effects of that crisis had spread across known space faster than hyperspace. Communication networks. What happened in the Academy's medical bay had become legend, studied in medical schools from the Andromeda sector to the edge of Klingon space. The human who had saved 14 lives with kitchen utensils and battlefield medicine had become either a hero or a cautionary tale, depending on which species you asked. Jiho stood in the preparation chamber, adjusting the traditional Korean hanbok that his parents had shipped from Earth at enormous expense. The deep blue silk felt strange over his academy medical robes, but wearing his cultural heritage alongside his professional achievement felt important. He was no longer just Dr. Jiho Kim, the first human at the Galactic Medical Academy. He had become something else entirely, a bridge between human brutality and galactic civilization, proof that sometimes the most violent-looking medicine was actually the most compassionate. The academy itself had changed dramatically since that night. In the medical bay, new courses had been added to the curriculum with names that would have been unthinkable 6 months earlier. Emergency decision-making under pressure, intuitive diagnosis techniques, and the wildly popular human emergency protocol. What tea? The alien faculty had once dismissed as barbaric improvisation was now being taught as a legitimate medical discipline. Professor Glimmerdust's office had become a shrine to human medical techniques, primitive surgical instruments hung on the walls like artifacts from an ancient civilization, including the actual butter knife that Jiho had used to save the Catherian child. Medical textbooks from Earth's greatest hospitals were being translated into 47 different languages, their techniques adapted for alien physiology. The ceremonial music began, a complex harmony created by 12 different species that somehow managed to sound both alien and familiar. Jiho walked into the amphitheater to find himself facing the largest graduation audience in the Academy's 1,000-year history. News crews from across the galaxy had come to witness the graduation of the human who had revolutionized emergency medicine. His fellow graduates were a sight to behold. Christek's crystalline form had been polished to mirror perfection, each facet catching the light and throwing it back in patterns that seemed almost musical. Mira's gaseous bodies swirled with colors that indicated deep satisfaction and accomplishment. Zentok had upgraded his sensor arrays for the occasion, adding decorative elements that made him look like a walking piece of abstract art. But it was the expressions on their faces that told the real story. These beings, who had once viewed human medicine as primitive brutality, now carried themselves with a different kind of confidence. They had learned to act under pressure, to make decisions with incomplete information, to accept responsibility for life and death choices. The human approach to medicine had infected them with something their species had never developed, the willingness to fight death itself rather than simply negotiate with it. The ceremony proceeded with typical galactic formality. Diplomas were awarded using holographic projection systems that could accommodate any known writing system. Achievement medals were presented through force field manipulation that allowed each recipient to receive their honor in whatever atmospheric conditions their biology required. When Jiho's name was called, the amphitheater erupted in something that could only be described as controlled chaos. Some species applauded in the traditional Earth fashion they had learned specifically for this moment. Others created harmonic frequencies that resonated through the station's hull. The crystalline beings reflected light in complex patterns that served as their version of standing ovation. Professor Glimmerdust approached the podium, his rainbow colors cycling through what Jiho now recognized as deep emotional resonance. In his manipulator appendages, he carried an artifact that made the entire amphitheater fall silent, the Academy's highest honor, a crystalline sculpture that had been awarded only 12 times in the institution's history. Dr. Jiho Kim, Professor Glimmerdust announced, his voice carrying clearly through the translation systems, has accomplished something that we believed impossible. He has taught an institution dedicated to careful, methodical medicine that sometimes the most merciful thing you can do is refuse to let someone die gently. The professor's colors shifted to deep blues and purples as he continued. 6 months. So we witnessed what we believed to be medical barbarism. We have since learned that what we called barbarism was actually a form of compassion so intense that it required courage we had never imagined. Jiho accepted the award, feeling its weight in his hands. The crystal seemed to pulse with its own internal light, and he realized that it had been programmed to respond to the life signs of whoever held it. In a way, it was the perfect symbol for what he had brought to galactic medicine: technology and intuition working together to preserve life. As the formal ceremony concluded and the various species began their different traditions of celebration, Christek approached with a small travel bag that gleamed with the same internal light as his body. His crystalline form had been modified with what looked like primitive surgical appendages, crude metal tools that seemed completely out of place on his otherwise perfect geometric structure. "Human Jiho," Christek said, his musical voice carrying undertones of excitement and nervousness. "I have been accepted for a residency program at Seoul National University Hospital on Earth. I want to learn more about your barbaric methods." Jiho couldn't help but smile at the sight of his crystalline friend equipped with human surgical tools. "Fair warning, Christek. Human medical school is brutal. We believe that if you can't handle the stress of training, you can't handle the stress of saving lives. We're going to push you harder than anything your species has ever experienced." Christek's internal lights pulsed with determination. "I have watched you work under pressure that would have shattered most of my people. I have seen what it means to fight death itself instead of negotiating with it politely. I want to learn how to be that kind of doctor." Around them, other members of their graduating class were making similar announcements. Mira had been accepted for advanced trauma training on Earth's orbital medical stations, where her ability to phase through matter could be combined with human emergency techniques. Zentok was planning to study battlefield medicine with Earth's military medical corps, despite the statistical improbability of his mechanical nature surviving human military training. Even more surprising were the Earthbound applications flooding in from across the galaxy. Medical schools throughout human space were being overwhelmed with requests from alien students who wanted to learn what was being called aggressive compassion medicine, the brutal, fast-paced training that had always characterized human medical education was suddenly being seen as a feature rather than a flaw. Looking around at his graduating class, Jiho felt something he hadn't expected: deep pride mixed with profound responsibility. These alien beings had learned to see medicine not as a gentle art of careful deliberation, but as a desperate battle against mortality itself. They had embraced the human philosophy that action was better than inaction, that causing pain to prevent death was not cruelty, but compassion, that accepting responsibility without guarantee of success was the true mark of a healer. The Academy's halls would echo with the sounds of rapid response training from now on. Simulation chambers would ring with the urgency of battlefield medicine. Students from dozens of species would learn to make life and death decisions in seconds rather than cycles, to trust their instincts when data was incomplete, to fight for every life with whatever tools were available. Most importantly, they had learned the most fundamentally human approach to medicine: the absolute refusal to give up. When death came calling, when the odds were impossible, when everyone else said it was time to let go gracefully, humans had taught the galaxy to respond with two simple words: not today. As Jiho walked out of the amphitheater surrounded by alien friends who had become brothers and sisters in the fight against mortality, he realized that humanity had once again done what they did best. They had taken something the rest of the galaxy considered impossible and made it routine. They had shown civilizations millions of years older than Earth that sometimes the most horrifying thing you could witness was someone who absolutely refused to give up. The human approach to medicine was spreading across the stars like a benevolent plague carried by alien doctors who had learned that the most barbaric thing you could do was let someone die without a fight. The end.